Hello developers, my name is Matt Rabel and this is a screencast that shows you how to build a basic CRUD application with Angular 7 and Spring Boot 2.1. We'll basically build an application that shows a list of cars, allows you to edit those cars, and then we will pull from Giphy an animated GIF that matches the car name, and from there we'll go ahead and add authentication with Okta to really lock things down and secure it very securely. So I'm going to use a demo script that I wrote that's available in the blog post GitHub repo. You'll see that there are IntelliJ Live templates that I will use. These are specified in the brackets, for instance, boot entity Lombok, and you can find those in my idea live templates repo on GitHub. So let's begin. The first step is to go to start.spring.io and select JPA H2 REST repositories Lombok web and actuator, but I've actually created a shortcut for that called boot start. And then I'll create a directory to hold both the client and the server, cd into that, and unzip demo.zip into a server directory. And then I'll open up server in IntelliJ. And then I'll navigate to the demo application, and I'll go ahead and add an entity called car. So boot entity, and I'm going to use Lombok. So there we have that, and then I do like spaces. IntelliJ knows me so well. And then I will create a repository to persist that entity, and we'll call this car repository, extends JPA repository, and JPA repository has basically all the CRUD methods that we might need to find our entities, to save them, as well as to delete them. And you'll notice we also use REST, or repository REST resource that exposes this repository to allow you to do CRUD from a REST standpoint. And so then the last thing we're going to need is just some sample data. So this is an application runner. You can see that it streams a list of car names, Ferrari, Jaguar, Porsche, etc., and then goes ahead and saves those as a repository using the repository, and then does a find all and prints them all out at the end. So at this point we can run our application, and we're running on Java 11. That's a feature of Spring Boot 2.1, and you notice it prints out everything, so it is saving those in the database. I'm going to create a cool cars controller, and what this does is it uses that repository. It has a cool cars endpoint that finds all of the cars, filters out the ones that aren't so cool, and then collects them and returns them. So you can see an AMC Gremlin, a Triumph Stag, Ford Pinto, and Yugo GV are generally considered not that cool. And so because we have dev tools in our class path, we can just recompile this demo application, and Spring Boot will actually restart everything for us. And at this point we can hit everything with a tool called HTTP. So HTTP 8080 cars. You can see this is from that repository REST resource. It actually lists all the cars and their links and does it in a very nice RESTful way. Now if we did cool cars, we'll only get the ones we really like, right? And now we'll go ahead and add a new one. So 8080 and cars, one of my favorites, the VW bus. You'll see it adds it with an ID of 10, so then we could update that if we wanted. Say HTTP put and 8080 cars 10, and then we could say F8 the bus, which is a 21 window 1966 bus that I own. Awful fun to drive. So there you see it updated the name, and then we can also delete. And now it'll no longer be there. if we listed all of the cars, right? So we have our Spring Boot API working. Now let's turn to the client. So Angular has a CLI that allows you to create new applications quickly and easily. If I print out the version, you'll see that I'm using 7.0.6 of that. I'm using Node 11 as well. Pairs up nicely with Java 11. And I can do ng new client. I will add Angular routing. I'll just use CSS. And you'll see that took about 1 minute and 50 seconds to create. If I cd into client, I can cat package.json, and you'll see it's using Angular 7.0. So you might be wondering why that took so long, especially since I chose CSS. It's because there's something in there that seems to compile libsass, and that does take a while. I'm not sure why that is, but that's the reason it takes so long. If I do npm start, I can actually see the default app that Angular CLI creates. So that's at localhost 4200, and you can see that's the basics of it, not a whole lot. So if we were to stop that and install ng material, I have an alias for that, so alias grep material. You can see that's what it looks like. So ng material just installs those dependencies. I'll use them later, I won't use them right now. And then the first thing I'm going to do is generate a car service to talk to the API. So I'll open this project up in IntelliJ as well. And there's a couple different ways to generate components. You can do it from the terminal using something like ng generate service shared car. And I'll go ahead and generate those for you. I'll show you the other way in a second. Now I can search for car service, find it here. The first thing I want to do is give it a HTTP client dependency. And then I'll define a getAll method that returns an observable of just anything right now, and we'll return, there's actually a shortcut I use from Angular live templates called HTTP client get. Then we can do localhost 8080 cool cars, delete that and change this to HTTP. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. The next thing we'll want to do is import that HTTP client module so we can use that HTTP client. Okay. And then we'll generate a car list component. So this can actually be done from the IDE. Create a new Angular schematic type component, and we'll just call it car list. And you can see it executes those same commands that I did for you. So now if I was to look at car list component, first thing I'm going to want to do is give it a dependency on that car service. So private car service of type car service, and then in ng-init I'll do this car service getAll, subscribe to it, and send that data to a local variable called cars. And I need to define that, so private cars of type array, and we'll just use an any for now. And then we'll need to modify its template to show that list of cars. Car list, and use div, and there's also a shortcut here for ng4, so car of cars, car.name. So now we should be able to see our list of cars, but we do need to modify the main application component and clean it up a bit here, and then we'll just do app car list. And so that name matches the component itself, right, in the selector. So now we should be able to start our app using npm start. See what it looks like. So it has the car list, but you'll notice there's an error in your console that it can't get to cool cars endpoint because of a cross-origin resource sharing policy that doesn't allow it to. So we have to go back to our Spring Boot application, and we have to add a cross-origin annotation. $4,200, and then we'll go ahead and put it on our REST repository, or repository REST resource as well. And then we can recompile this class. It'll restart Spring Boot for us, and now everything should work. Alright, we're getting the list of names now. So our cool cars are coming through. Now we need to add Giphy support, so we see some cool like names, and we'll add material as well so we see a little bit better design. So we'll go to the app module to add our imports. Browser animations module, the map button module, card module, input module, list, and the toolbar module. So we'll import those. Okay, and now we'll go ahead and modify this app component to use toolbar. So it uses the matte toolbar with the color as primary color. And then we'll modify this car list component to use a card. So it has that title in there, like car of cars, and it actually has that Giphy URL already specified. So then we change the title, and then we'll need to add our styles. It imports the indigo pink thing from Angular material, as well as the material icons, and then sets the body, margin, and the font family. The last thing we'll need to do is create the Giphy service. So you can again use schematics if you want, and do service and Giphy. Then we could specify here that we want to use HTTP client, but rather than doing all that, I'll just do ng Giphy service. You can see that it has an API key that's specified in Giphy's API repository as a public beta key. So if you're doing betas or you're doing demos like this, then you can easily use it, but they don't advise you to use it in production. I limit it to one result because otherwise it comes back with like 25 different images. Uses the HTTP client and goes ahead and takes the search term, calls the API, and then it pipes that and the response to basically say, hey, if there's more than one, then go ahead and just set that first one as the data that we're going to return. And then of course there's a dancing cat if you wanted to see that as well. So it's always fun to look at a dancing cat. There he is. Alright, so now that we have our Giphy service, I'm going to actually move this into a different directory. Call it Giphy, and then just move everything up into it. And now in my car list component, I can go ahead and import that as a dependency. And then I can use a shortcut I have for the loop. So we'll loop through those cars and basically make a call to that Giphy service and go grab the URL for each one of them. And then if we go to the car list component, you'll see it's already in there. So now we're getting our list of cars back, right? You can see the Ferrari, the Jaguar, the Porsche, Lamborghini, and Bugatti. They each have images associated with them now from Giphy. So I'm going to add an edit feature because it's not all that great to just display data. It's nice to be able to edit it. So I'll run ng generate component car edit, and then I'll go into that list component, and first of all I'll link to the car edit screen. So this uses a map button, and then it uses the router link to go to that car edit, passes in the ID, and just displays the name. And then I'll also add a button at the bottom that allows you to add a new car. Because we're going to create a form, we'll need the forms module. So I'll import that in my main app module. And then I'll also add routing to app routing. So you see it goes to the car list by default, and then there's a car list component and a car edit component. Okay, so we've imported our car edit and our car list. And now we'll need to modify our car service to have more than just a get all. So first of all, we'll define our API and then our specific car API, because we'll just be calling cool cars, but when we send our data back, we'll be going to that REST repository. We allow it to just get one with a get and then save. If it's already exists, it has an href on it, then I'll go ahead and do a put, so it just updates it. And if it doesn't, then I'll do a post and send the whole thing to just that endpoint. And then the remove does an HTTP delete. And then for our component itself, this guy implements on init and on destroy, and you'll notice it just saves the car in a local variable, and then it depends on activated route and router, as well as the car service and the Giphy service. The reason for the activated route is so it can actually get the ID as a parameter, and if that exists, it goes ahead and fetches that car and then sets it locally and goes ahead and uses Giphy to get a matching image. And then if it doesn't have an ID, then it just displays a blank form. This ng on destroy is because we're basically setting this observable to a local subscription, and we want to unsubscribe from that when we leave this component. And the go-to list just navigates back to the car list, and this is used when we save a form or when we remove. And so then we can make the template look good using this map form shortcut I have. So this uses a mat card and a form called car form, and when we click on submit, it goes ahead and saves that, and then this title will say edit or add card depending on which one we're doing. It stores the href as a hidden variable in case that comes through, so we can determine whether it's a add or an edit or a put or a post. And then we have the car name that's in a mat input field, and that's all we really have in this entity, so not much more to do there. The save button is disabled if the data is not valid, since the name is required. And then the delete will call the remove, and we can cancel and go back to the list. And now in our edit or our app component, we can remove this guy, since we're using routing for that. And so at this point, we should be able to start everything up again. And try again. Giphy's a little slow, so now we can go into Ferrari, and you'll see it has the image there, and we could also modify it, say Ferrari 2, and now it has a different image, right? Because it brings back a different name. We could also add a new one, say one of my favorites, a VW bus, and then if we click on that, you'll see it shows a different image. And we can also delete it. Okay, so we have everything working now with Angular talking to Spring Boot, modifying its data and displaying its data. Now I want to show you how to add authentication with Okta. So we'll start with the Spring Boot API and go into its Maven pom.xml and add some dependencies. So this adds two dependencies. One is the Okta Spring Boot starter, and then Spring Security's OAuth 2 auto configuration. And so there are two different ways that you can actually configure Spring Boot and Spring Security with OAuth in Spring Boot 2.1. You can use this technique with the Okta Spring Boot starter. You can also use Spring Boot's OIDC support, but that requires a few more dependencies. So this is why I'm just doing it this way, because it's a little simpler and it has less properties. I'm going to enable a resource server because our API is only going to require that you send in an access token. It'll validate that access token, make sure it's the proper one and that it validates and that it hasn't expired, and then it'll go ahead and authenticate the user and give them the data they're requesting. You'll need to define a number of properties for Spring Boot and Spring Security. So I'm going to rename this to a YAML file. And you'll see it has Okta OAuth 2 client ID and issuer. So what you didn't see is me actually creating a new app on Okta. So if you go to developer.okta.com, and if you haven't created an account, you'll need to sign up for one. So you can do that up here with the sign up. Since I already have one, I can just log into an existing one. So I'm going to use this 737523, and I don't know any password, so using one password, I'll sign in. And then what you'll do is you'll create a new application, single page app, and you'll say like Angular 7 rocks. And then for the base URIs, you'll want to use 4200. And everything else remains the same, and then you can click done and it'll create that application for you. Then you can grab the client ID from the bottom, and I could substitute that in here instead of the other one. And so at this point, if I were to restart my Spring Boot API, everything should be secure. So if I go to localhost 8080, you'll see full authentication is required. So we can't access this resource unless we pass in an access token. So to do that, you'll need to implement Okta's Angular SDK on the client. Oops. So in the client here, we can cancel the process or stop the process. And go ahead and run a shortcut I have called Okta Angular. That does an npm install of Okta's Angular SDK. And you can ignore these warnings. Even though it says it requires an older version of Angular, it actually works just fine with Angular 7. So in the app module, I can go ahead and first of all specify the configuration. And I forgot to grab the client ID, so we'll get that from our server right here. Copy that into our client. Okay. And we'll also need to import the Okta OAuth module and init its auth with that config. And then we import it from the Okta Angular SDK. And then we'll go ahead and modify our routing to have the callback. You'll see it's for that implicit callback that was specified on our application. Add the import. And then we'll also create an auth interceptor. And this auth interceptor will basically add that bearer token or the access token to the header for all its HTTP requests that go to our Spring Boot API. And you'll see it implements HTTP interceptor. It uses the Okta auth service, and it basically intercepts every request and calls the handle access method. And so what this does is it says, hey, if the request actually has local host in it, then go ahead and add the access token. This is because if you send a bearer token to Giphy's API, it actually fails. So of course, in production, you're going to need to modify this or come up with a better way to write an interceptor like this. But once it's got that access token, it goes ahead and adds an authorization header with bearer, space, and the access token. And then you'll need to register this as an interceptor provider in the app module.ts. So this says, hey, provide HTTP interceptors and use the auth interceptor class and make it all work. So then we can modify the app component to have a login button. So you'll see here it's got this toolbar spacer and this matte raised button for the logout. So it's going to put it on the right. That's the whole point of the toolbar spacer. And then if they aren't authenticated, in the matte card content, it'll show a login button. So we do need some CSS to make that work. So since it's using the flex layout with material design, that's how you do that. And then we'll also need to modify the app component itself to be security aware. So it has a is authenticated local variable. It uses that Okta auth service, and this ng init you need to implement on init, and then it basically checks to see if the user is authenticated, and it subscribes to authentication state changes. So that will allow these variables to work, right? If it's authenticated, it'll call that and everything will work. So now we can show the application, start our Angular app again. Go back to 4200. And you'll see we already logged in since we actually logged into our app. So one of the problems that you'll see when you're not logged in is you have a login button and you have the car list. So the easiest way to fix this is to actually have a separate component that's your landing page. So I'll create a home component for that. New schematic component, and we'll just call it home. And in this home component, just like we had in our app component, we can actually copy and paste this into our home component and take our app component to what it was, which is very simple. And in our home component, we can put this code. And so now it's authentication aware, and in its HTML, we'll go ahead and specify that login button if they aren't authenticated, and if they are, then show them the car list. and then we'll want to modify that app component to remove this login button. And then it'll restart everything. We can see that it's actually working. So if we were to go to the beginning screen, it's actually blocked by CORS, right? So if we were to go to our Spring Boot API, we don't quite want full screen, but oh well. We can go into the demo application, and we can add a CORS filter bean. So you can see here, this is a simple CORS filter. It uses a URL-based CORS configuration source. It allows credentials. It allows 4200. It allows all methods, all headers, and if you want to lock things down, of course, you want to change those. And then it registers that at the root directory, and it goes ahead and sets it as a highest precedence. And so this is necessary because Spring Security isn't quite integrated with these cross-origin annotations. So this is the solution for that. And then we can recompile, and it'll restart our application. And now if we refresh, it almost worked. Okay, maybe try the good old-fashioned restart. Okay, let's try logging out, or an incognito window. Localhost 4200. Why isn't it prompting me to log in? That's strange. Let me look at my steps for a second here. So if we look at, I think I know what it is. If you look at our app routing, it's still going to car list. So we need to change the first one to home, and then we need to add one for home. So duplicate that. Path to home and home component. Easy mistake to make. Now we'll want to go to home by default, and now it prompts us to log in. And you can use the username and password that you signed up with. Then click on the car list, and now it all works, and you can go into your Porsche and change it to a different type of Porsche, and it goes ahead and changes the images. So there you have it. This has been a demo of Spring Boot 2.1 and Angular 7. You can find the GitHub repo for this on GitHub at Okta Developer, Okta Spring Boot 2, Angular 7 example. My name is Matt Rabel. You can find me on Twitter at mrabel. You can also follow Okta Dev on Twitter to get all of our updates for when we post new tutorials. Never build auth again. Friends don't let friends write authentication on developer.okta.com. You can find me on LinkedIn at mrabel, and on my personal blog at Rabel Designs. Thank you very much for listening and watching today, and I hope you have a great day.